If we think we can't change the world, we never will. One of the things that holds us back from allyship is the limiting question of what can I, as one person, do? In today's episode of the Leadership Project, I'm joined by Dr. Poornima Luthra of the Copenhagen Business School. We discuss the ripple effect of allyship. Many of us want to be an ally, but we don't always know where to start. Dr. Luthra shares with us how to get going with allyship and how to convert action into a multiplication effect. Enjoy the show. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Leadership Project. I'm greatly honoured today to be joined by Dr. Poornima Luthra. She's an associate professor at the Copenhagen Business School, and she's also the author of 3 compelling books: Diversifying Diversity, The Art of Active Allyship, and Leading Through Bias. So you can already imagine from that introduction what we're going to be talking about today. We are going to do a deep dive on diversity, equity, and inclusion around topics like bias and how we can be better allies as leaders. Diversity, equity, and inclusion needs to be on the agenda of every leader, of every business, of every organization out there. But rather than just dialogue, we need action. We need actionable insights. So Poornima and I today are going to talk exactly about that. It will be a deep discussion, but we'll also be encouraging you to think about how you can be an ally and how you can take action to make sure that we address this topic once and for all instead of just talk about it. So without any further ado, Poornima, I'd love it if you would give us a flavour of your background and what it was that inspired you to be critically obsessed, I'm going to say, and that's a positive word, not a negative way to say it, your obsession with diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yeah, thank you so much, first of all, for having me. Delighted to be here and having this conversation with you. So if I look back on my childhood, so I was born in India and I left India at the age of 6 months, and I grew up in the UK in Manchester, where my dad was doing his PhD, and then moved to Singapore at the age of 4. And Singapore is, for all intents and purposes, home. So I think I define myself more like a global citizen these days, having lived in so many different parts of the world, and moved to Copenhagen almost 9 years ago. I've lived in Canada in between, lived in Copenhagen as well prior to this 9-year stint as well. So that's a little bit about my kind of international background. So I'm of Indian origin and lived in Singapore for most of my life. And I think one of the things that my mom tells me, at least when I was a child, was there was 2 things that I think she noticed as trends or patterns in my behavior. And one of them was that I was deeply interested in education and being a teacher. So right from being a young child, setting all my teddies and dolls and whatever else I had, and my sister when she'd oblige, and I would teach. And I always knew that education was where I wanted to be. And the other pattern that she noticed was I would be deeply affected by inequality that I saw around me. So when we traveled, we as a family traveled a lot. I'm very fortunate to be able to do that. And we traveled, of course, in many parts of Asia, including India, of course. And in those experiences, every time I came across income disparity, inequality that I saw, socioeconomic inequality around me, disability, it affected me deeply. And that was something that I think was always there, that there was a desire to want to do better, to shift things in the world and make them more equitable. But also as a child, as a teenager, young adult, you perhaps don't know how to do this. Or at least when I was growing up, we didn't have necessarily the tools. Education was very different. This wasn't a focus area, at least in Singapore and in Asia when I was growing up. And so there were not really any outlets in that sense to try to find ways to lift others. But I had a break in between my 12th grade exams and joining university. And I had 6 months, and I spent that time volunteering for an organization that catered for the needs of lifting young people, children and young people with disabilities, particularly what they called mental and intellectual disabilities at the time. We're much better today in how we look at some of these words and language and making it more inclusive as well. So that was also a defining moment in saying that, I want to be doing something in the future, having impact. within my own spheres. I wasn't in any way delusional or naive to think that you can change everything in the world, but I do believe that within our own spheres of influence, we do have the capacity to be able to shift the way people think about things, to address systemic issues. So I think those are the influences that have driven me to where I am. I have a squiggly career. My bachelor's degree is an engineering one. Look, I grew up in a South Asian family. There were 3 options on the table: engineering, law, or medicine. And quite frankly, I always wanted to do HR, and human behavior interested me. But, what kind of career would that be, was the response I got from people around me. So I was good at math. I was good at physics, very stereotypical in many ways. And so I went down the path of doing engineering. But it was during the engineering degree that actually I did a lot of cross-faculty courses in human behavior, in HR, in org behavior, organizational behavior. And I loved it. And that was where I did well. I used to, ace those exams and loved studying it. So I think it reinforced the belief that that was where I was meant to be. So I have a squiggly career that takes its way around different places, but comes back to doing my PhD in human behavior and understanding it, and then working very much within the area of DEI during my PhD program.
So thank you for sharing that, Purnima. It's really interesting. I love this term squiggly career. I feel like I've had one of those as well, by the way. But what I take away from squiggly career is diversity itself. And diversity isn't just a gender or a race or a religion thing or an age thing. It's about diversity of thought, bringing engineers together with people from social sciences to solve the world's problems, for example. So having a squiggly career makes you well qualified to understand diversity of thought. That's the first thing I've got to say. The second part, the second and third, is this desire for education and then seeing a problem in the world, which is the inequality and the lack of equity in the world. So I think that's absolutely beautiful. And then the third thing I thought when I was listening to you was when you said that I didn't think for a second that I could change the world overnight. However, if I extrapolate from that, what I was also seeing in you, that you do realize that, but if we have that attitude of we can't change it, we never will. So it's people like you and people can be in our audience listening right now who take action that do see the change in the world. How does that sit with you?
Yeah, absolutely. And, that's where allyship comes in, right? And so when I was writing my second book, The Artifact of Allyship, I wanted to dispel that myth, that apathy that many of us have when we look at the problems of the world. And whether it's with sustainability or we look at inequality in the world, it can seem like such a mammoth problem and issue that needs to be addressed on so many different levels. And it does. It is a mammoth problem and it is a mammoth challenge. And we do need to address it on so many different levels. But at the same time, I wanted to also dispel the myth that we can't do anything, because I think that's what holds us back. Because in thinking about it as such a big problem, we forget that actually within our own spheres of influence, whether it's at home, whether it's with our friends and our social circles and with family, or it's at work, right? And a lot of my work, of course, research focuses on the workplaces. We do have that capacity to make the spaces that we're in more inclusive. We do have the capacity to challenge the systems around us to make them more equitable. And I'm a firm believer in the ripple effect, right? You go to the pond and you pop a stone or a pebble in and you see that ripple effect. If we have that positive impact on others, hopefully that will then help them carry through with having a positive impact on their own spheres of influence. And I believe in humanity. I'm a realistic optimist. And, I do believe in the power of humanity and the goodness in humanity. Yes, there are folks out there who are resistant to change, who are, fighting the change and the shift towards inclusive workplaces and societies. But the vast majority of us do believe that this is the right thing to do. It should be done. And it benefits everybody. It's not just for the groups that that are underrepresented. An inclusive environment is shown time and time again through research to benefit everybody in that environment. So, I think it's that apathy that I was trying to fight, I think, in myself, maybe. It was that inner demon, right, that's telling you, well, what do you think you could do? You're just one person. But, so many years on from then, and in the work that I'm doing, I think it's been reinforced that, of course, you can make a difference within your own spheres. So for anyone listening out there, if you're thinking that, what can I as one person do? There's plenty that we can do. And that's what my second book is about, personal action.
So let's unpack that a little bit more. So what I'm loving here is that, okay, let's accept it. It is a big problem. And if we take a defeatist attitude that we as individuals can't change it, we will never succeed. So inaction will lead to nothingness. It'll no change whatsoever. What I love about this ripple effect that you talk about in dropping the stone and the ripple effect, for that to be effective though, there needs to be some kind of multiplication, right? So how do we make sure that our allyship is something that has a multiplication effect where you use the words that our actions influence others who then influence others. It's like a network effect to make sure that the actions of a few turn into an action of a group, turn into an action of multiple groups. How do we get that multiplication effect going, Poornima?
Yeah, I think, human beings, we're observers, consciously and subconsciously. We're observing people around us. And for those of us who decide to be active allies and to step up and do things, people are watching, they're observing, and we're role modeling. And so if they see that what we're doing is having a positive impact on others, and also the way we lead, right? Coming back to thinking about inclusive leadership, and not just leadership from the standpoint of having a title in the organization, but really looking at leadership as this idea that we have that sphere of influence, and our ability to be able to influence others, hopefully positively, is something that we all hold within our own spheres. And if we see positive impact that people are having, then it motivates others to say, hey, could I also do that? This is someone at my peer level, or this is someone that I work with. And if they're able to do it, and if they can see positive impact on others, but also on themselves in their ability to be able to lead better and their teams doing better, functioning better, having greater psychological safety, the levels of interactions between team members being more productive, when they see those positive impact, improved well-being so much, right? That we can improve creativity, innovation, all of those things, then, hey, you never know. But I do believe that in humanity that, people will look at it and say, yeah, I would like to try that. I'd like to see how it goes with my own teams, with the people that I'm working with my family. So I do think that there's that ripple effect that can happen. It needs a few people to start, though. So you're right in saying, you do need a few courageous souls to take it on, to say that, all right, I'm going to be the active ally and I'm going to role model these behaviors. But we have momentum now. This is not 20 years ago. When I started doing my research about 15 years ago, there were conversations in some pockets in the US, for example, but when you looked globally, and a lot of my work is done outside of the US and with global companies, they could be, based in the US, but they have global operations. And in many parts of the world, DI wasn't even on the agenda 15 years ago, right? It's a relatively new subject area, but there's momentum. There's pressure, there's momentum. It's coming from different ways. It's coming from employees in the organization. It's coming externally from compliance that, especially in Europe, for example, with legislation that's coming into place as well. So there's push that's coming in to leaders in the organization to step up and do something. So there's momentum. I think now's the time to capitalize it on and help that ripple effect take effect.
All right, so let me play back what I'm taking away from that, Purnima, and this is specifically to the audience. I'm talking to you here right now to think about this in your local realm. Purnima and I are really talking about global and regional effects and the like, but you could be taking what Purnima is talking about. You could do it just within your organization. You could work in an organization of 300 people and you could start having an impact. And what I'm hearing from Purnima, it takes a few to act, to get going. And then what I'm taking away is we then need to notice and name when the benefits start to be realized and herald those benefits so that everyone sees and recognizes it as well. And when they see that it works, they won't be so defeatist about it. They won't just shrug their shoulders and go, oh, it's too big, it doesn't work, it's a losing battle. We need to convert that attitude of a losing battle into, I'm going to say it's almost like the confidence cycle, that when you start seeing it work, it gives you even more confidence to keep going and then keep going. And now we start getting the ripple effect or the snowballing effect. How does that sit with you, Purnima?
That sounds great. That sounds really good. And I see that, with the companies and clients that I work with in different parts of the world. It starts with a few who are keen to take this on, and it can start from grassroots levels up with ERGs, employee resource groups that are active. It can also start from the top. I do a lot of inclusive leadership training for senior leaders in organizations. And when you see that shift in mindset happening there, and when they start questioning and when they start making changes happening within their teams, you'll see other functions looking at them and saying, this function seems to be doing really well. And they seem to have a certain culture within them that seems to be really positive. And you have so many different people of different backgrounds and experiences that are coming together and working in a way that seems to really add value. And that creates curiosity in people to want to say, well, what are they doing? What is it that they are engaging in that's different from how we're doing things? And that curiosity is beautiful. And if people allow that curiosity to fester, and if they seek out answers and information to satisfy that curiosity, and that's when you start seeing that ripple effect happening.
Yeah, absolutely love it. How do we make sure, like you mentioned about ERGs before, how do we make sure that it's not just rhetoric, right? So there are companies out there, I don't want to be too harsh on them, but I'm going to say that there's still some companies out there that do D&I because they see other companies doing it, but they still don't fully realize why they're doing it. Like, how do we make sure it's true action and not rhetoric?
Yeah. So a few things actually in my book, Leading Through Bias, my co-author Sarah and I actually write that the first thing that we need to start with is leading with conviction. And that requires leaders in the organization to really understand why we are doing this. And a lot of the workshops that I do with very senior leaders in organizations, mid-level leaders as well, is first defining the why. And not just the why from the business case. So much has been written about that. And it's well established that there is a business case, financial, motivation for companies to engage in. But I'm more interested in the other things, the non-financial benefits that come from engaging in diversity, equity, and inclusion. And when we actually, do that well in terms of ensuring a cultural and systemic transformation. And we need to sit down with ourselves and find out what is our why. Why do we want to engage on this? Why is diversity, equity, and inclusion important to us? And we can look at it at different levels. I encourage people to look at it, yes, from the business standpoint. How will this help you achieve the targets that you have, perform better, ensure that your teams are working well together? But it's also a personal thing. I think, DEI, there's definitely a rational case for doing it, but there's also an emotional case for why we should be engaging on this. And I often ask people to go out there and to ask the people that they work with and their family members and, their children even, about why they believe DEI is important to them, right? And in talking to people, it helps affirm our own beliefs about why we're in this. And for some leaders, it's looking, yesterday I was doing a keynote and the leader who was, introducing me, he shared a personal story. He says, look, I have 2 daughters. And if I have to think about the world around me as being different for them than it is for my son, that's not the kind of world I want. And if I am in a leadership position, which he is in, to be able to make shift happen in some of the companies that I'm in, environments that I'm in, then I would like to do that. So finding your personal why, the conviction, and leading from that place of conviction is very important to me. So coming back to the question you asked around ERGs and just kind of a tick box saying, all right, we're facing pressure from some underrepresented groups in the organization. It could be people of color. It could be the LGBTQ plus community. It could be women in the organization. It could be our disabled employees. All right, let's create an ERG. And hopefully that will create an environment where they can vent. And in doing so, hopefully we pacify the issues that are at play. And if that's the attitude towards ERGs or DEI initiatives, they're not going to have that kind of systemic cultural transformation that we do need. At the same time, ERGs are very valuable if they are resourced well, if they have executive sponsorship in the organization, if they also open up for some events to be for allies as well, who can sit in, who can listen. And of course, ERGs should have guidelines around allyship, attendance and what that looks like, and, kind of those behaviors that we're expecting of allies who are part of the ERGs, that they're there to listen. They're not there to offer solutions immediately. It's about, reflecting upon what they're hearing. They're not there to be defensive about, well-represented groups. They're there to listen. And if we have these, behaviors established, I think ERGs can be extremely powerful. And some people ask me, what do we really need ERGs? Isn't that creating more division in organizations? Aren't we creating exclusion, right? We're trying to be inclusive, but ERGs seem exclusive. But the reality is we don't live in a world, and our workplaces are certainly not equitable or fair. And until we get to a space where it is equitable, where there is fairness, and people are treated in an equitable way, until we get to that, we do need psychologically safe environments for people from underrepresented groups to know that they're not alone, that what they're experiencing is what others are experiencing. And also then to use the data that comes out of ERGs to drive systemic change. So these are ways in which companies can use some of these, well-established practices within DEI to actually make change happen, rather than seeing it as all right, we have ERGs and celebrating the ERGs and putting it out there on LinkedIn and on, during the Pride Month or during International Women's Day. Hey, this is what our ERG did. Great. But it's everything we do in between these annual events. So what are they doing and how are they contributing towards systemic change? Are they resourced well? Do they have executive sponsorship?
I love it, Purnima. I'm going to play back to you some of the things that I'm taking away there. First of all, I would also say I'd love to see a world where we don't need ERGs anymore, but we're a long way from that. So until that day comes, we do need equity, and equity is different to equality. It's about making sure that we level the playing field, because we're not on a level playing field to begin with. Then what I'm loving is your focus on the why and putting it in two categories, and the emotional category. And let me unpack that in two different ways. The emotional category, first of all, no one deserves to work in a place where they feel excluded. Most of us have, at some point in our lives, experienced exclusion. It might have been in the schoolyard, it might have been in a social group. Somewhere along the line, you've experienced it. No one deserves to work in a place where they feel excluded. I loved what you brought up about, if you don't empathize with what I just said, would you be happy with your own son or daughter coming into that culture? Yes or no? Would you be proud of that? Yes or no? These are some really interesting questions to ask yourself. Then the rational level, and to me, that's multi-level too, Poornima. So the rational level is it makes business sense. First of all, if a worker does feel excluded, they're not going to do their very best work. If they feel included and empowered and energized, they do their very best work. And then when we go to the meta level of that, when we bring a group of people together with diverse backgrounds, with diverse interests, with diverse experiences, and they all feel included as part of something bigger than themselves, they can then co-create something that's far bigger than any of them individually could. So yeah, we do need ERGs. Focus on the why and focus on the emotional why and the rational why. How does that sit with you?
Yeah, that sounds really good, Mick. I think, you've captured what I said really well. And, there are multi-layers to the why. And I think very often in organizations, we tend to focus on the business case for it. And a lot of organizations still do. I know there's a lot written about moving away from the business case, and I write about that in my books as well. But I think that when we look globally and when I look at companies in different parts of the world with different starting points and journeys in their own DEI, roadmap, the business case is still out there, and people are seeing it as a means of even getting the kind of leadership support that they need to move the needle. So we need to think about the business case. We shouldn't stop there. And no business case nuanced, right? We need to go into those layers about it's not just the financial benefit. It's thinking about innovation, creativity, thinking about employee well-being. It's thinking about whether our organizations are actually representative of the customers we serve or serve. It's thinking about if our organizations are actually representative of the demographics of society that we're in. And especially if we're a global company, really thinking about what that is across the different markets in which we're represented. So really thinking through all that. And at the end of the day, also thinking about it being the right thing to do, that there is a moral and ethical stance to this. And I think, thinking about all those layers and then thinking also about the emotional. And I feel that we can move people when there is that emotional connection, right, to this. And, we talked about children, and children are one of the ways that we want to hopefully leave a world that's better for the younger generation, whether we have children or don't have children. It could be nieces, it could be nephews, it could be just the younger generation that we're thinking about. But I also think that, and I'm going to share a story of an experience that I had in one of my training sessions that I was doing for a very large, fast-moving consumer good client. And I think it really nicely illustrates that it's the personal connections that sometimes drive people. So I was doing a training, started off, it was the first of 3 sessions that this large group of leaders were going to be going through with me. They were in smaller groups of about 10 people. And this was the first session of these 3 sessions. And I had a Danish man, he must have been in his early 50s, who walked into the room and he came straight up to me and he said, "We don't need this. Our organization is very inclusive. I don't know why we're spending these 9 hours together on this. I don't think we need any of this." So I acknowledged it. I said, "Thank you so much for sharing your view. I'm glad you felt comfortable to be able to share that with me. This is mandatory. So why don't you sit through it today and we'll have a chat at the end of today to see how you're feeling about it and we can see where this goes." And so he sat down, kind of leaning back in his chair, arms crossed, disinterested on his phone. And he stayed that way for the good first hour that I was providing an introduction into the topic and getting people warmed up and all of that. And then we did an exercise and an activity, and one of his colleagues shared his experience. And he was sitting right next to him. And apparently, I didn't know at that time, but through the conversation, they were very close colleagues. They worked together. And this man was a Greek man, quite a bit younger than him. I would say maybe around 35, between 35 and 40. And he said, "I'm really tired of people around me constantly making fun of my Greek accent with the way I speak, making fun of the food that I eat, making fun of Greek culture." And he said, "It really, really affects me." And this man looked at him because he was obviously one of them that did make fun of his Greek culture. And he looked at him and he said, "Yeah, but you laugh along with me." And this Greek man looked at him and he said, "Just because I laugh along doesn't mean that it doesn't affect me and that I don't feel excluded." And that moment changed that Danish man's approach to this. From that moment, he sat up. He was engaged. His phone was put away. His laptop was away, and he engaged. And he did not come to me at the end of that 3-hour session to see whether he could get out of the remaining 2. He, in fact, came up to me and said, "You've given me a lot to think about, and I'm going to be back for the next one in 2 weeks." So there's an emotional case for this. Now, this was someone who was a leader, and he'd heard in his organization everything about the business case. This was an organization that had communicated the business case really well. But there he was. What was really getting through to him was the emotional case. And so I just want to emphasize that, we need both. I'm not saying we don't need the other, especially in parts of the world that are just, at the infancy of this journey. We do need the business case, but we also need the emotional case.
There's 2 powerful things I'm taking away there, Purnima, and one is the awareness, and he needed that moment of awareness, and then the power of the personal connection. So when it impacted, when he could see that it was impacting someone that sounds like was a close and dear friend, he was probably mortified to have that moment of realization that he had been impacting the person. A really powerful story, and it is emotion that drives our decision making. We might rationalize things, but we're emotional creatures at the end of the day, so I really love it. Let's bounce off that a little bit more. Let's get deeper into allyship. Now, I'm going to be biased and stereotypical here, and those that know me, I'm your stereotypical middle-aged white man of privilege, right? But I want to be an ally. I want to do better. I want to change the world. But I have to tell you that as an ally, a lot of us don't know how. So if people are listening to this right now, Poornima, and they're going, yeah, they might resonate with this story that you're talking about, the Danish man and the Greek man, they might go, oh, that sounds just like an experience I've had. How do they start? How do they start if they want to be an ally?
So The Art of Active Allyship, which is my second book, unpacks and seeks to answer the question, what can I do? So very much like you, Mick, this question has come up to me for many years about saying, I want to do something, but what can I do? We also live in a world where there's a lot of fear, especially today in 2024. There's a lot of fear around diversity, equity, and inclusion. There's a cancel culture. There's so much about what you can say and can't say. Am I doing the right thing? Am I not doing the right thing? And so this is something that, I do believe that people want to do something. They want to act, but they're not really sure what it is and how they should approach it without getting it wrong, right? We live in this perfectionist world where we want to get it right. When it comes, I'll start off before I kind of go into the behaviors to say that allyship is a journey. And how I define allyship is that it's a lifelong journey of building, supporting relationships with people who are different from ourselves, people from underrepresented, marginalized, discriminated groups. And because it's a lifelong journey, it's really about progress and not perfection. We are going to make mistakes along the way. I've made so many mistakes in interacting with different communities and different groups, but allowing, again, going back to Carol Dweck's work around keeping a growth mindset, that every experience where we do falter, where we don't get it right, where we might use the wrong pronouns, or we don't know enough about this community and we say something that is insensitive or incorrect, when we do get the feedback, to take that feedback as a learning opportunity for us to do better the next time. So progress over perfection for me is extremely important with allyship. And moving ourselves from being passive allies to active allies requires us to engage in frequent and consistent behaviors. And that means, making sure that it's not just the once a year things that we're doing, it's the everyday events. It's the everyday behaviors. So let's jump into what these behaviors are. Now, to show up as an active ally, you first need to do self-work. We all need to do self-work. And that starts with deep curiosity. So I am a big believer in curiosity. So starting with deep curiosity to find out about yourself as well. Mick, you talked about yourself and described yourself and as someone of privilege, right? Understanding our own diversity thumbprint. Who are we? What is our identity across different dimensions? And which of our identities gives us some advantages in life? And which ones do we potentially experience bias or discrimination in? So some self-work around understanding ourselves, and then having the deep curiosity to understand how someone different from myself, who has a diversity thumbprint that's different from my own, how do they experience the same environments that I'm in? It could be our communities that we're in. It could be education systems. It could be our workplace as well. And so how did they experience it? And we don't need to ask people to explain their life stories and what they're experiencing. There's a wealth of resources out there. 20 years ago, there was hardly anything written in popular media around this that was easily accessible. Things were behind paywalls with research articles. But today's world is very different. You can listen to podcasts like this. You can pick up a book. You've got audiobooks. There's short articles from very reputable sources, like Harvard Business Review, for example, that you can pick up and read. Having that deep curiosity to find out how someone from a different, intersectional identity, how do they experience the world around me? So it starts with deep curiosity and then moves on to honest introspection. As I write in my books and on the back of my first book, Diversifying Diversity, if you have a brain, you're biased. Everyone is biased. And we have this belief in our mind that if we are biased, we're a really bad person. And so we'd like to think that we're not biased. We have an I am not biased bias, right? And that we need to move away from that, and we need to break that equal sign between bias and being a bad person. We're all biased. And even well-meaning, well-intentioned, good human beings are also biased. We are socially conditioned. We use mental shortcuts. Our brain receives a vast amount of information. We can't cognitively process all of it. And so we have to, from a neuroscience perspective, we have to use these mental shortcuts, these heuristics and algorithms. But they affect how we interact with others, and they affect the decisions that we're making at work. And this is where we need to start becoming more aware, honestly introspecting around where our biases lie. And then that moves on to the third behavior, which is humble acknowledgement. And that builds deeper into privilege, really saying that I don't know. I actually don't know how someone else who's different from me, how do they experience this? Because as human beings, we have a desire to assume everyone is experiencing the same meeting, the same lunchroom conversations in the same way, but they're not. And so being and humbly acknowledging that those environments, those situations that we're in are not experienced in the same way, reflecting on your own privilege and then saying and using that privilege to be able to lift others. And there's a lot of negative narratives around privilege. And I'd love for your listeners to really reframe privilege, to see it a strength from which we can actually help and lift others, to be that active ally, rather than seeing it as something that we have to be ashamed of, something that we have to hide from. So moving from that narrative to thinking about privilege as something more constructive and positive that we can use to effect change around us. And then with this, so the first 3 behaviors in my book are all about self-work. We need to do the self-work before we can engage. And it then moves into empathetic engagement. So how do we engage with others on topics that are difficult? Bias, how do we address bias? Most of the time when we bring up bias, it's met with a wall of defense. Oh, come on, I was just joking. Can't you take a joke? You've become so serious. Or I really didn't mean it that way, or you're overthinking it. Those are usually the responses we get when we address people's biases. And so how do we move towards having those more empathetic conversations? Because today it might be someone else's bias that you notice. Tomorrow it could very well be our own, right? Even for those of us who come from underrepresented groups in different environments, we have biases. And today we might identify someone else's biases, let's say around racism or sexism or homophobia. But tomorrow it could very well be our own biases in one of those areas or in other areas that someone else points out. So we need to approach it with more empathy from that place of wanting to help others to do better, and also to treat ourselves with empathy as well. That, all right, you got it wrong this time. That's okay. Learn from this, move on, try and do better the next time. Take time to deeply introspect as well, right? So engaging empathetically. And then moving on to having authentic conversations. So I'm a big believer in Professor Amy Edmondson's work around psychological safety and applying it within the DEI space. It's really about having those authentic conversations, spaces where we can have honest and open discussions. I think we live in a world, as I said earlier, there's a lot of fear, for both sides, both those who are well represented and part of the dominant groups and organizations, but also for those who are underrepresented. And creating spaces where we can have those honest conversations, for the well-represented to say, I don't understand how to do this. I'm not sure what's needed of me. I'm afraid of getting it wrong. Can you help with this? And for the underrepresented to say, hey, look, I really don't want to be seen as a token. I'm not a tick box here. I'm not the diversity hire. I'm not someone who should be seen as a super token or a token in this space. I want to be valued for who I am. I bring a lot to this table, to this meeting, to this organization. And to be able to have these honest, open conversations, which I don't believe we're having enough of. And then we move to the last two, vulnerable interactions. Look, at the end of the day, we're aware of some of our biases, but there are many that we just simply don't know. To be able to check my biases with them. If I'm saying something, doing something, just being able to check that off. And the last one is courageous responsibilities. There's a lot to unpack in this one, so I'll keep it brief and kind of highlight the main areas. One is inclusive communication. Really being intentional about the language that we're using. There's so many words that we use in our day-to-day vocabulary that are actually fraught with bias embedded within them, right? So things like, hey guys, that's become quite popular. People have become very aware that we need to move from hey guys to hey everyone. Things like blind spots. I'm still surprised how often I hear the word or phrase blind spots being used. This is my team's blind spot, or this is my team's handicap. I've heard that a few times as well. And so really moving from that to using inclusive language, but also questioning some of the language around us, right? There was a period of time a few years ago when we questioned things like policeman or fireman. And now we've moved from that to looking at it as police officer and firefighter, but also looking at things like the master bedroom, and was recently over the weekend having a conversation with some friends in the evening, just chatting about vocabulary. And master bedroom is something that is so deeply rooted in slavery. And so where do these terms come from, right? And I've used them, right? In Singapore, at least when you look at, part plans, it's called the master bedroom. So you're grown up in an environment where that has just been the vocabulary that we've used. And until about 10 years ago, I hadn't really thought about master bedroom as being connected with, in spite of being in this line of work, right? So we're so conditioned into just accepting some words as they are. So inclusive language is really important. And then challenging the system, right? In our organizations, I talk about this in the Art of Active Allyship, that we have what I call a cookie cutter syndrome. We have these cookie cutters, prototypes of who we consider to be ideal leaders and employees in our organizations. And we hire and we promote people who fit into the cookie cutters. So challenging the system, challenging the way that we hire, promote people, give opportunities to people to break and melt those cookie cutters down. And that's a really big part of courageous responsibilities. And that's a big one, right? We could have an entire podcast talking about what does it mean to engage in systemic change, right? But I'll leave it at this. So these are the 7 behaviors that I look at.
Really powerful, Poornima. I'll share some of the things that I was taking away from listening to you. Your progress is better than perfection. Okay, so that's a really good one. And allies do get frozen. We don't want to make a mistake. We want to, we have that cringe factor of, oh, what if I get this wrong kind of thing. But taking the growth mindset, learning and growing as we go, try it on, notice and name what works, what doesn't work, If you do get it wrong, apologize and learn from it. And then we start seeing action. But if we don't, we'll never take the first step. So that was really powerful. Then the self-work and really thinking about ourselves and the deep introspection, the curiosity, really powerful, the open, authentic conversations about the topic, being able to be humble and say, I don't know what it's like to experience the world through your eyes, and having that curiosity and the humble curiosity that comes along with that. And then being able to embrace things like our courageous action around addressing some of our biases. We know we have them. We're all human beings. We all have these biases. How are we going to take courageous actions ourselves, but also collectively in a business to have the right conversations to challenge the status quo, to move us on to the next level? So really powerful stuff there, Purnima. You touched on one in the middle that I'd love to unpack a little bit more, which is, this is one that I get nervous about. This is why I'm bringing it up. A situation that happens in boardrooms around the world. This one's gender specific, but please don't take the example. It's just an example. What I'm about to say can be translated in multiple ways. A woman in the boardroom comes up with the best idea the company's ever heard, talks about it, and she gets spoken over. And then middle-aged white man, sorry to say it, middle-aged white man says the same idea, phrased a little bit differently 15 minutes later, and everyone's applauding and going, yeah, what Jim said, kind of thing. At that moment, if I'm in that room, I want to speak up and I want to say, hang on a second, isn't that what she said 15 minutes ago? Why didn't everyone applaud when she said that? But here's my nervousness. In speaking up and trying to be an ally for the person that was spoken over and not heard, am I disempowering her? That's my nervousness. What would you do in that situation to be a proper ally?
That's a really great question. And I think a lot of people feel this because there's also the part of allyship that people talk about is you don't want to disempower someone. You don't want to take their voice away from them. You don't want to be speaking on their behalf. So how do you know whether it's okay in that space to be able to do so? I think a lot of it comes down to reading the room, unfortunately. Like there's no one way to do this. You have to read the room. And when you see, that female colleague's reaction to Jim, in this case, was the name you used. Jim's, taking credit off or saying the same thing and getting credit for it. I think reading the room in that sense to see that discomfort there and giving maybe a pause to say, all right, will she say something? Will that person step up and say something in her own defense? But it's really hard. I mean, Mick, I've been in those situations in boardrooms, and it is so hard when you are it's called bro proprieting, right? But it's, I look at it in my book and I call it dom proprieting because it's dominant groups proprieting, ideas and things from non-dominant groups. And when you're in that situation, actually, I think most people, unless it's someone who's very much able to advocate for themselves, most people would really appreciate an ally in that moment. And boardrooms in particular are high intensity, high power environments. There's so many power dynamics at play in that space. And everyone is playing a power game to some extent in that space. And so I think having someone step up to be the active ally yourself in that moment to say, hang on, I actually think, this was said, if I'm not wrong, so-and-so said this just earlier, I think credit should go there, and I think that would be really valued. Of course, you could read the room wrong and the person could come up to you later and say, hey, I could have done that for myself. Thanks a lot. I really didn't need you to step up for me. And depending on the person, they could approach it in a way of saying, next time I can handle it, or be more, aggressive in that way. But I think that's also a learning, Mick. I think, if we take it that, hey, I really want to step up, and yeah, sometimes I might get it wrong. And in the future, I'll know that this person wants to advocate for themselves, but you've already shifted the dynamics in that room. You've already got people thinking that there's someone in the room who is going to call out, who's going to intervene if someone takes credit for somebody else. That means immediately people in the room are going to be more watchful. They're going to watch their behavior. They're going to say, all right, I'm not taking someone else's ideas. I might build on someone else's ideas, but I'm going to give credit where it's due. So you've already had a positive impact, even if the person themselves feel that, I could have advocated for myself. So, and engaging in that conversation with them as well. Say that, look, I understand that where you're coming from. At the same time, I felt like I couldn't not do anything. I really wanted to, but I understand, where you're coming from. And so tricky. I'm not saying it's easy, but reading the room, you may get it right, you may get it wrong. You might also have the person come up to you later and say, thank you. But I just froze. I just couldn't. And this has happened to me so many times before. I was so triggered inside. There was so much emotions going on. I just didn't want to speak because, I knew I would be coming from an emotional place as I engaged on it if I did advocate for myself. So I really appreciate you redirecting credit back to where it's due. So I know it's tough, but I do think that there's positive in doing so.
Everything you just said is the embodiment of the advice that you're giving. So the progress over perfection, that you're already having an impact by speaking up. And yeah, if you get it wrong and the other person comes and tells you later, well, you learn from it and you do better next time. But not acting is not the right thing. You need to be able to speak up. Yeah, I love it. All right, Purnima, you've given us so many great things for allies to think about. You've given us a framework for us to go through this self-work, get that curiosity to know and notice and name our own biases, but also to have that empathetic action around understanding that other people do not experience the world in the same way that you do, or the environment in the way that you do. Because the shoe can be on the other foot, by the way. You can step into someone else's world and not experience it in the way that they do as well. So have that empathy, have that compassion for yourself that you won't always get it right. Take action, learn, grow, and we can change the world. We can change the world if we all put our minds and our action to it. Thank you so much, Purnima. I've absolutely loved our conversation. I'd like to now take us to our rapid round. So these are the same 4 questions that we ask all of our guests. So what's the one thing you know now that you wish you knew when you were 20?
That every individual can make change happen.
That's powerful and very aligned with your work. I love it. What's your favorite book?
Oh, I have so many books, but I do love Invisible Women by Caroline Perez. I think it's a very powerful book. It's one of the early books that I read when I was writing my first book as well. So I normally don't read while I'm writing because I find that it affects, what I'm writing. But I really love that book. And it's such a powerful book in helping us understand how much of the world around us caters for some groups and not others. And of course, it looks at gender from a binary gender perspective predominantly, but it can easily be extrapolated to others. So I love Invisible Women. Yeah.
All right, brilliant. I've not read that, so that's one for me to put on my list. I love it. What's your favorite quote?
So it's right here and on my desk, so I'm going to read it out. It's by Toni Morrison, and it says, if there's a book that you want to read, but it hasn't been written yet, then you must write it.
Love it. That's great advice. And there's lots of people out there that I'd love to see write a book that never take action on that as well. There you go. All right, brilliant. All right. And finally, there's going to be people listening to this either individually or from an organizational point of view that are listening to your advice here, your model, the way that you go about this, that will want to know more. How do people find you?
LinkedIn is the best way to get in touch with me. I'm most active there, so please do reach out on LinkedIn. I'm not really great on other social media channels, so LinkedIn it is.
Okay, brilliant. Dr. Poornima Luthra, thank you so much for your time today, for your wisdom and your insights. I also want to thank you on behalf of everyone for the work that you do. Congratulations on your success, but more importantly, on your impact, and that your actions create that ripple effect that you spoke about earlier in our program, and you help us to multiply the action that's needed so that in the future we don't have to have these conversations, because we do get to an equal world where everyone has equal opportunity. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much, Mick. That was a lovely conversation. Thank you.
You've been listening to The Leadership Project. Don't forget to subscribe to the Leadership Project YouTube channel, where you can join in to our live stream shows on The Leadership Project Live and watch video podcasts of selected episodes. In the next episode, I'll be joined by Lon Stroshine, the founder of the Normal 40 movement. Lon will share with us the secrets of finding true fulfillment beyond financial success. You don't want to miss this.
Thank
Thank you for listening to The Leadership Project at mixbeers.com. A huge call out to Faris Sadek for his video editing of all of our video content, and to all of the team at TLP. Joanne Goes On, Gerald Calabo, and my amazing wife, Say Spears. I could not do this show without you. Don't forget to subscribe to the Leadership Project YouTube channel, where we bring you interesting videos each and every week. And you can follow us on social, particularly on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram. Now, in the meantime, please do take care, look out for each other, and join us on this journey as we learn together and lead together.